It's the early hours in a dimly lit, smoke-filled room in Liverpool. The walls are peeling, the air thick with stale beer and cigarette smoke. The Beatles, still just a local band, play their hearts out, unaware that this moment will become the turning point of rock history. The smell of sweat mingles with the bitter scent of cheap alcohol as the bass drum shakes the floor, vibrating through the very bones of the audience. The audience is indifferent. Few even know their names. The drummer's hands shake nervously, beads of sweat rolling down his face. A guitar string snaps mid-song, adding to the chaos. And yet, in the midst of this, one sentence will change everything. They were nobody until they became the Beatles. How did four underdog musicians, surrounded by failure and obscurity, become the most famous band in the world? It all started in the gritty, working-class streets of Liverpool, where dreams seemed as fleeting as the fleeting glimpse of a passing train. The band that would eventually be known as the Beatles was far from the global powerhouse we know today. Their early years were filled with rejection, hardship, and a sense of aimlessness that could have derailed anyone's dreams. But for John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the path to greatness was paved with challenges. In 1957, John Lennon and Paul McCartney first crossed paths in a local church hall during a skiffle group performance. They weren't immediately a perfect fit, but something clicked between them. They shared a passion for rock and roll, particularly the music of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. Their chemistry was undeniable, and soon, McCartney joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, which would later evolve into the Beatles. But even with this spark of creativity, success was nowhere near guaranteed. The band struggled to gain a following. Early gigs were unremarkable at best, and their first manager, Alan Williams, couldn't provide much direction. But Liverpool was their proving ground, and they played anywhere they could, back alleys, dives, and even in Hamburg's notorious Reeperbahn district, known for its rowdy nightlife and seedy venues. Their performances were often wild, uninhibited, and raw. The crowds were tough, with little respect for the scrappy young lads who had no solid fame to their name. Their first recording session at EMI Studios in 1962 was a disaster. They were rejected by the label, and a memo from producer George Martin called their audition unsuitable. This rejection, however, became the fuel for their fire. Martin would later admit that he had been wrong. In fact, it was his eventual faith in their raw potential that would lead to one of the most historic moments in music. In a turn of fate, Ringo Starr replaced Pete Best as the drummer just before their big break, completing the lineup. This was the moment the band truly began to come together, and the fire that would ignite their careers was ready to burn. They didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. It would be the hardships, the failures, and the constant battles that would eventually lead to their monumental success. Their transformation from a local Liverpool band to international icons was nothing short of a miracle. But first, they had to survive the odds stacked against them. It was a frigid morning in 1962 when the Beatles received their first dose of serious rejection. Despite their raw energy and undeniable chemistry, their early attempts to secure a record deal were met with cold indifference. The famous rejection letter from Decca Records is now a part of rock history. "We don't like their sound. Groups with guitars are on the way out." But rather than breaking their spirits, this brutal dismissal set the stage for one of the most iconic turning points in music history. The Beatles' breakthrough came not from conventional success, but from sheer determination and luck. Their persistence paid off when George Martin, a producer at Parlophone, took a chance on them after witnessing their energetic live performances. Martin's belief in their potential was a game changer. He didn't just see the raw talent, he saw a revolution in the making. he quickly reworked their sound, tightening up their performances and adding new layers to their musical identity. Their first single, Love Me Do, was released in October 1962. It wasn't an instant smash, but it marked the beginning of something bigger. The track was a modest hit, but it was the launchpad for what would soon become a cultural phenomenon. The real breakthrough, however, came with their second single, Please Please Me. Released in early 1963, it was a game changer, catapulting the band into the public consciousness. As Please Please Me soared to the top of the UK charts, the world began to take notice. Suddenly, the Beatles were more than just a local act, they were becoming a global sensation. The speed at which their fame spread was nothing short of staggering. By the end of 1963, they had revolutionized the music industry and were already poised to conquer the world. What set the Beatles apart wasn't just their sound, it was the way they captured the cultural zeitgeist. Their blend of infectious pop melodies, sharp wit, and working-class charm made them the voice of a generation. Their music spoke to the youth of the 1960s, tapping into their hopes, dreams, and frustrations. The Beatles didn't just create songs, they created anthems for a cultural revolution. By 1964, their presence in the United States was undeniable. When they arrived at New York's JFK Airport in February, they were greeted by a sea of frenzied fans, the likes of which the world had never seen. The British invasion had begun, and the Beatles were at the forefront, setting the stage for a cultural shift that would redefine music, fashion, and youth culture for years to come. Their rise was meteoric, and within months, they had gone from struggling musicians to the most famous band in the world. It was a journey fueled by rejection, resilience, and a spark of serendipity, but it was only just the beginning. In the mid-1960s, the Beatles were no longer just a band, they had become a cultural phenomenon. But what made their music so revolutionary? At a time when rock and roll was dominated by the sounds of Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, the Beatles took the genre and transformed it into something entirely new, something that resonated with a generation on the brink of change. Their sound, lyrics, and style would not only define the 1960s but also shape the music of the future. The Beatles' experimentation with musical styles was a defining feature of their rise. By 1965, with albums like Help and Rubber Soul, they had already begun to move away from the traditional pop formula. Songs like Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, featured new exotic instruments like the sitar, a nod to their growing interest in Indian music. It was a subtle yet profound shift that set them apart from their contemporaries. Their music was no longer just catchy tunes. It was about exploring new sounds, breaking boundaries, and offering listeners something that challenged their expectations. As the world around them became more politically and socially turbulent, the Beatles' music became a soundtrack for change. The youthful optimism of Rubber Soul was soon followed by the introspection and experimentalism of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The latter, released in 1967, was nothing short of a revolution in both sound and concept. The album pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the studio, with psychedelic effects, innovative use of technology, and intricate arrangements that made it one of the most groundbreaking albums of all time. The Beatles weren't just making music, they were crafting an experience. Sgt. Pepper's wasn't just an album, it was a cultural artifact that encapsulated the spirit of the 60s. The songs were deeply personal, yet they reflected the social and political upheaval of the time. A Day in the Life was a sonic journey that combined lush orchestration with jarring dissonant sounds, making it a powerful commentary on the disconnect between the media's portrayal of events and the stark realities of everyday life. But it wasn't just the music that set the Beatles apart. Their impact extended far beyond the studio. Their unique fashion, their haircuts, and their ability to express their personalities through their music and interviews made them symbols of the cultural shift occurring in the West. They were the embodiment of the counterculture movement, and their influence was felt across every corner of society. In a sense, the Beatles created the blueprint for modern celebrity culture. They were no longer just musicians. They were icons whose personal lives, opinions, and creative visions were just as influential as their music. This level of visibility and influence was unprecedented. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the revolution they were leading through it. The Beatles had become more than just a band. They had become a mirror of society's changing values. They were shaping the world as much as the world was shaping them, and their impact on both the music industry and the culture at large would be felt for generations. As the Beatles' fame soared to unprecedented heights, so too did the pressure that came with it. The very things that had made them icons, their relentless touring, their ever-growing fan base, and the constant media attention, were now the forces pulling them apart. The harmony that had existed within the band began to unravel, and the members, once bound by shared dreams, began to fracture under the weight of their success. The pressures of constant touring and recording took a toll on the band, but it was their personal lives that began to spiral out of control. The introduction of drugs into their lives marked a pivotal moment in their trajectory. What began as experimentation with marijuana in the early days of their success soon escalated into heavier drug use, including LSD. In the mid-1960s, the Beatles became associated with the counterculture movement, embracing the psychedelic revolution that was sweeping across society. This influence permeated their music, particularly in albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, but it also had a dark side. As the band's creativity flourished, their interpersonal relationships deteriorated. John Lennon, once the band's primary creative force, became more reclusive and disillusioned with the world around him. Paul McCartney, who had always been the more composed and business-minded member, began to clash with John over artistic direction and decision-making. George Harrison, frustrated by his limited role in the band's songwriting, began to explore his own spiritual path, leading to tensions with his bandmates. The animosity within the group was further exacerbated by the emergence of Yoko Ono, John Lennon's new partner. Her presence in the studio and at band meetings sparked outrage among the other members, particularly Paul McCartney. Many saw Yoko as a disruptive force, but it was clear that Lennon's emotional attachment to her was creating a divide that couldn't be ignored. The band that had once functioned as a cohesive unit was now struggling to maintain any semblance of unity. By 1968, the stress had become unbearable. The Beatles were no longer making music together for the love of it. They were doing it out of obligation and pressure. The decision to record the White Album in separate locations, with each member contributing their individual tracks, was a reflection of how fractured the group had become. What was meant to be a collaborative effort had turned into a series of solo projects tied together by a shared name. Amidst all this chaos, the band's relationships with their fans and the public were also starting to show signs of strain. The once loving image of the Beatles, the mop-topped boys next door, had been replaced by a group of men who were disillusioned, weary, and growing more detached from the world they had helped to create. Despite the friction, however, there was still the hope that the bond they shared could overcome the personal and creative rifts. But as tensions continued to rise, the inevitable collapse loomed on the horizon. The Beatles' golden age, which had seemed invincible, was starting to fade. And what came next would change the music industry and their lives forever. By the late 1960s, The inevitable had arrived. The Beatles were falling apart. The band that had once been a symbol of youthful optimism, joy, and unity was now a fractured group of individuals, each with their own desires, dreams, and frustrations. The tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years finally erupted in 1970, when the Beatles officially broke up, leaving fans and the world stunned. The cracks had been forming long before the band's public dissolution. Their final studio album, Abbey Road, 1969, was a masterpiece, but even its creation was marked by infighting and creative tension. The collaborative spirit that had fueled their earlier albums had been replaced by solo efforts, with each member retreating into their own creative world. While McCartney, Lennon, and Harrison each produced some of the most innovative music of the era, their contributions to Abbey Road were increasingly disconnected. It was clear that their once harmonious collaboration was coming to an end. The band's internal discord was further exacerbated by external pressures. Alan Klein, the business manager Paul McCartney had reluctantly agreed to work with, was seen as a divisive force within the group. His aggressive business tactics and his involvement in managing the Beatles' finances only deepened the rift between the members. McCartney, in particular, became disillusioned with Klein's methods, leading to a breakdown in the band's already fragile relationship. But it wasn't just the business side that was causing turmoil, it was the personal lives of the band members. John Lennon's marriage to Yoko Ono had sparked tension, and the pair's increasing involvement in the band's creative decisions created friction. While John was deeply focused on his relationship with Yoko and their avant-garde art projects, Paul McCartney remained steadfast in his desire to maintain the Beatles' musical direction, causing bitter disagreements. Then, there was George Harrison, who had long felt like an outsider in the band. Despite being an incredible guitarist and songwriter, he was often sidelined in favor of John and Paul's compositions. By 1969, Harrison had grown tired of his limited role and began to push for more control over his own music. His frustrations came to a head during the Let It Be sessions, which were fraught with tension and conflict. Harrison walked out of the sessions, and while he later returned, the damage had been done. The Beatles were no longer a unit. They were four individuals working independently. In the midst of all this chaos, Paul McCartney made the decision to leave the band. In April 1970, he publicly announced his departure, citing personal and professional reasons. The news sent shockwaves through the music world. The Beatles, the most influential band in history, had officially broken up. The band's final album, Let It Be, was released shortly after McCartney's departure, but by then, the magic that had once bound the Beatles together was gone. The breakup of the Beatles marked the end of an era, but it also signified the beginning of their solo careers. Each member would go on to create music that was both reflective of their time with the band and deeply personal. McCartney's Band on the Run, Lennon's Imagine, Harrison's All Things Must Pass, and Starr's Ringo became iconic albums in their own right, but none could ever recapture the magic of the Beatles. The legacy of the Beatles, however, would live on. Despite their breakup, they had forever changed the landscape of popular music, influencing generations of artists and fans. Their music continued to be celebrated, and their impact on the world of music and culture was undeniable. In the end, the Beatles had achieved what few others ever could. They had become legends. Despite their tumultuous end, the Beatles' legacy has only grown stronger over the decades. Their influence continues to permeate the music industry, culture, and even global politics. As the years passed, it became clear that the Beatles were not just a band, they were a cultural force that transcended their time and place. Their impact would be felt for generations, with their music and ideas reshaping not just the sound of rock, but the very way we experience popular culture. One of the most significant ways the Beatles changed music was through their approach to album making. Before them, most pop and rock music was crafted as a collection of individual songs. But the Beatles were pioneers in the concept album, an album where each song was intricately tied to the whole. Albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the White Album became not just collections of songs, but experiences, musical journeys that challenged listeners and invited them into the band's unique world. This was a turning point in how albums were produced and perceived, influencing everyone from Pink Floyd to Radiohead. In addition to their approach to album structure, the Beatles also revolutionized the studio recording process. They were among the first to embrace the potential of studio technology, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They experimented with tape loops, reverse tracks, and multi-tracking, which had a profound impact on how music was recorded. This spirit of experimentation helped pave the way for future genres, from progressive rock to electronic music. The Beatles were also deeply influential in how music became intertwined with social change. They became symbols of the counterculture movement, their songs resonating with the frustrations and hopes of a generation. All You Need Is Love, a simple but powerful anthem, became a rallying cry for peace and unity during the social upheavals of the 1960s. Meanwhile, John Lennon's vocal opposition to the Vietnam War and his subsequent activism highlighted the role musicians could play in addressing social and political issues. His song, Give Peace a Chance, remains a timeless call for peace. Their style and image also had a profound impact. The Beatles not only revolutionized music, but they also became fashion icons. Their mop-top haircuts and sharp suits became a symbol of youthful rebellion, and their ever-evolving style, from the sharp suits of their early days to the more eclectic psychedelic looks of the late 1960s, mirrored the changing cultural landscape. They set trends not just in music, but in how young people dressed, spoke, and thought. Beyond their impact on music and culture, the Beatles also reshaped the business side of the industry. Their ability to control their own artistic and business decisions set a precedent for future artists. Their relationship with their manager Brian Epstein and later their own company, Apple Corps, marked a significant shift in how musicians could exert control over their careers. This was a game changer, leading the way for other artists to follow suit and gain greater independence in their business dealings. Today, the Beatles remain a touchstone for every generation of music lovers. Their songs continue to be played, their records still sell, and their cultural impact remains unmatched. Even in the age of streaming, the Beatles' music has an enduring presence, and their albums are consistently ranked among the greatest of all time. From their humble beginnings in Liverpool to their reign as global superstars, the Beatles' journey is a testament to the power of creativity, persistence, and vision. Their story may have ended with a breakup, but their influence is eternal. The Beatles weren't just a band, they were a movement that forever changed the music world and beyond. As the Beatles' fame skyrocketed, so did the rumors, conspiracies, and urban legends surrounding their lives. While their musical legacy is undeniably rich, there are darker, more mysterious elements to their story that continue to captivate fans and theorists alike. Some of these tales have become ingrained in pop culture, blending the lines between fact and fiction. One of the most well-known and unsettling rumors revolves around Paul McCartney's supposed death in 1966. According to the legend, McCartney died in a car crash and was secretly replaced by a look-alike, a conspiracy that was allegedly hinted at in various Beatles' albums. Fans point to cryptic messages in songs like Revolution 9 from the White Album and I Am the Walrus from Magical Mystery Tour. claiming that these tracks contain hidden references to McCartney's supposed demise. The most famous piece of evidence comes from the supposed clue on the cover of Abbey Road, where McCartney is barefoot, an apparent symbol of death. Fans quickly latched onto the idea, with theories swirling that his death had been covered up by the band and their management. However, the truth behind the Paul is dead theory is far more grounded. The rumors began as a hoax, fueled by the public's obsession with the Beatles and their cryptic lyrics. In fact, McCartney himself played into the joke when he appeared in interviews, laughing about the theory and making light of it. Yet, despite its clear absurdity, the Paul is dead conspiracy remains one of the most talked about Beatles myths. But there are other, less fantastical rumors tied to the Beatles that have more than a hint of truth. For example, many fans believe that the band's time in the studio was haunted by eerie occurrences. The most famous of these stories involves their recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. According to some accounts, strange and unexplained events took place during the sessions, from lights flickering to the sound of phantom voices. George Harrison, in particular, was said to have had a deep interest in the spiritual and the occult, and some suggest that his spiritual explorations influenced the band's music during this period. Some even claim that Harrison had experienced paranormal encounters during the recording of their albums. Yet, the skepticism surrounding these ghostly claims is just as strong. One possible explanation is the band's increasing use of drugs, particularly LSD, during this time. The mind-altering effects of these substances could easily have contributed to the band members' perceptions of the paranormal. Their growing interest in Eastern spirituality and mysticism may have also fed into these supernatural tales, blurring the line between reality and their artistic vision. While it's easy to dismiss these stories as pure speculation, they continue to fuel intrigue among Beatles fans and conspiracy theorists alike. The truth, as always, may never be fully known. But what is undeniable is that the Beatles' story, both real and imagined, continues to captivate and mystify us, leaving us to wonder, were they simply a band of talented musicians? Or was there something more, a deeper, unknowable force that guided their rise to fame? In the end, these paranormal rumors, whether true or fabricated, only add to the mystique of the Beatles. Their legacy, intertwined with both the tangible and the fantastical, is forever etched into the fabric of popular culture. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the Beatles were no longer the young, carefree band that had conquered the world in the previous decade. The disintegration of their relationships, both personal and professional, had taken its toll on the band, and with each passing year, the magic that had once bound them together began to fade. But even as the group reached its final moments, the impact of their last projects would continue to resonate long after the breakup. The Let It Be sessions, recorded in 1969, were among the final chapters of the Beatles' career, but they were far from the joyful and creative experiences the band had enjoyed in their earlier years. The recording process for Let It Be was tense, fraught with disagreements, and marked by the band's emotional and creative exhaustion. The album, released in 1970 after McCartney's departure, was meant to capture the band's return to their roots. However, the tension in the studio was palpable, and the resulting album lacked the cohesive energy of their earlier works. One of the most poignant moments of the Beatles' final years came when McCartney announced he was leaving the band. The decision sent shockwaves through the music world and essentially marked the official end of the Beatles as a unit. McCartney's departure was driven by a combination of creative differences, personal frustrations, and the chaotic atmosphere within the band. His departure didn't just signal the end of a musical era, It was the final straw in the disintegration of a group that had once been the epitome of harmony. Though McCartney left the band in 1970, the breakup was far from clean. The members continued to interact and occasionally collaborate, but the heart of the Beatles had ceased to beat. Their last efforts as a band were seen in the form of Abbey Road, which, despite the fractured relationships, remains one of the most beloved and influential albums of all time. The songs on Abbey Road were the result of each member working in relative isolation, with McCartney and Lennon contributing their own pieces, and George Harrison asserting more of his own voice on the album. Despite these tensions, Abbey Road would be their last masterpiece, an album that encapsulated the end of an era. The public fallout from the Beatles' breakup was intense, with legal disputes and personal animosities playing out in the media. The band's decision to part ways, especially after such astronomical success, left fans reeling. The Beatles had become more than just a band, they were a cultural touchstone, and their dissolution seemed to mark the end of something greater than just the group itself. It was a moment of immense loss for their millions of fans, as well as for the music industry, which would never be the same. But even after their breakup, the Beatles' influence continued to grow. Each member of the band went on to create solo projects that, while often very different from their time together, reflected their continued musical evolution. Paul McCartney's Band on the Run, John Lennon's Imagine, George Harrison's All Things Must Pass, and Ringo Starr's Ringo were successful in their own right, proving that the individual members still had the creative spark that had initially brought them together. Ultimately, the breakup of the Beatles, though tragic and filled with bitterness, didn't erase the monumental impact they had on the world. It simply marked the end of one chapter, while leaving the pages of history open for new stories to be written. Their legacy, shaped by both their unity and their division, has lived on, influencing countless generations of musicians, artists, and fans alike. The Beatles' influence on music is indisputable, but what makes their legacy so enduring is the way their music has continued to evolve alongside modern culture. Decades after their breakup, their songs are still played in every corner of the world, and their influence can be seen in nearly every genre of music. What began as a revolutionary force in the 1960s has transformed into a timeless legacy that transcends generations. The Beatles didn't just create hits, they created timeless anthems that still hold relevance today. Tracks like Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Imagine continue to resonate with listeners, both for their emotional power and their universal themes. Their music taps into something deep within the human experience: love, loss, hope, and change. These songs have become more than just part of pop culture. They've become the soundtrack to many of life's pivotal moments, from weddings and graduations to protests and political movements. Beyond their music, the Beatles' cultural impact has never waned. The iconic images of the band, whether it's the mop-top haircuts, the psychedelic colors of Sgt. Pepper's, or the serene barefoot stroll across Abbey Road, remain ingrained in the global psyche. They were trailblazers in every sense of the word, influencing not just the music industry, but also fashion, art, and societal values. Their willingness to push boundaries and experiment with new ideas made them the ultimate cultural icons whose appeal extended far beyond the world of music. Their ability to constantly reinvent themselves was a key factor in their enduring legacy. Unlike many artists who get caught in the trap of repeating their earlier success, the Beatles constantly evolved, from their early pop hits to the deep introspective works of their later years. Each album they released was a step forward, showing a new side of the band's creativity and vision. This willingness to embrace new musical styles, from folk to psychedelia to Indian music, kept them at the cutting edge of popular culture. Even as the band members pursued their solo careers, their collective influence remained present. John Lennon's Imagine is one of the most enduring political anthems of the 20th century, while Paul McCartney's band On the Run continued to push musical boundaries. George Harrison's All Things Must Pass is often considered one of the finest solo albums by a Beatle. Ringo Starr's work also remained beloved, proving that each member of the band had something unique to offer. The Beatles also paved the way for the modern music business. They were among the first to take control of their own creative direction, establishing the model for artists' autonomy in the industry. Their decision to launch Apple Corps in 1968 marked a pivotal moment in music history, giving artists more control over their brand and intellectual property. Today, this model has been adopted by countless musicians who follow in the Beatles' footsteps by managing their careers and brands directly. Even as the world changes and new generations come of age, the Beatles' music remains a constant source of inspiration. Their work continues to influence countless artists, from indie musicians to pop superstars, ensuring that their legacy will endure for decades to come. Whether through their groundbreaking albums, their unwavering dedication to their craft, or their status as cultural icons, the Beatles have become a permanent fixture in the world of music, a legacy that will never fade.